Well, thank you, Representative Blackwell and Representative Fisher, members of the committee. My name is Dr. Terrence O. I'm at Hillsdale College. I'm a former school head of the classical charter school in Colorado, and I helped Hillsdale College set up classical charter schools around the country. And I'm happy to be able to speak to you today on Common Core, and I hope my remarks will be helpful, and I'll leave some time for questions at the end. The first thing that I would say that struck me when I first looked at the Common Core is that it's not a Common Core. And in fact, there's been, I would say, an instance of brand theft committed here. Because what people in education reform have known for a long time is the Common Core is a center, it's a canon of great books that everyone would recognize. Shakespeare, Melville, Hawthorne, and people like that have recognized quality and that everyone knows are important and that we should all read. We should read them in common and have discussions about them. And they're a core because they get to the heart of the matter, specifically the heart of the matter that deals with what human beings are and what they've always been. And that's what we're trying to do when we educate young people. We're trying to make them into good human beings, and we're trying to get them to a state where they understand humanity and also understand the natural world. But today I'll be talking mainly about the English standards. So the first thing I guess I would say is that the actual aims of education that have been laid out by the Common Core are limited aims, because the document itself echoes with really one main theme, and that is college and career readiness. Now, I'm all for college and career readiness. I teach at college, and I want prepared students, and I certainly want there to be a vibrant economy, and everybody needs to get a job. But when you start out by saying, as the Common Core does, as all the textbooks now say, that college and career readiness is your highest aim, as opposed to truth, or virtue, or knowledge, or character, or something like that, which is what we've always said that education is for the last 2,500 years, then you set your sights low, and that's damaging. And it also is a fundamental mistake about what the human mind is. Because the reality is that most people are not confronting these days is that jobs are not what makes the human mind. The human mind is what makes jobs. And so if we go into the education, if we go into the school building thinking, oh, I'm here just to get ready for college or just to get a career, then we shortchange ourselves, our students, and their own minds. And just as a practical matter, you can think about that. When would you ever give a book to a fourth grader and say, here kid, read this, it'll make you ready for college? I have a 9-year-old, and that would not jazz him on reading any kind of book, although he loves to read. So that's the first thing that we should get a sense of. The second thing that's being done here in conjunction with this setting our aims low is this business about what's going on with the English curriculum itself. And there is actually a kind of revolution that is taking place in the Common Core. Because what they're insisting on, you can find this throughout the document, it's already there on page 3, is they're saying that we should study informational texts and give them every bit as much importance as we would classic literary texts. And they admit that this is a novelty. They don't really justify it, but somehow they think that the phrase 21st century global economy is going to make us bow down to these informational texts. And if you actually look on page 5 of the document, you'll see that by the time students are seniors in high school, they should be reading 70% of informational texts, according to the Common Core, and only 30% of literary texts. And they say that, of course, this is going to be done across the curriculum, but you can't actually believe that, because whenever anybody tries to pin them down, then the advocates and the architects of the Common Core will not give you a true number. And it's probably around, in the English class itself, around 50-50. And we'll talk about the textbooks themselves in a moment. But what does that mean by saying that students are going to be reading a lot more informational text as opposed to literary text? Well, it might mean that they're reading, and this is straight out of the Common Core documents, an article by Atul Gawande, which was published in the New Yorker in 2009, whose title is The Cost Conundrum, Healthcare Costs in McAllen, Texas. Now, if you know what was going on in politics in 2009, you know why people were talking about healthcare costs. And so this now all of a sudden is a document that has the same rank as a play of Shakespeare. How can they pull this off? How can they say that these informational texts, which no one really knows, that these are not things that we have heard about, that have been major shakers in terms of the world of even politics, how do they all of a sudden have the status of Shakespeare? Well, to pull this off, you have to have the rest of the document that is the Common Core, and what I had hoped to do is to read through this and try to help make sense of it, because it's a daunting document. In some ways, it's a poorly written document, but in other ways, it's a very cleverly written document, and we have to be able to read the tea leaves, so to speak. The first thing that you do is you start out with these standards. And the advocates of the Common Core claim that they're only a set of standards, that they're not going to dictate curriculum, that they're not going to dictate teaching, and we'll find out that that's not true. But even if we take them at their word and we look at the standards and try to understand what those standards are, we see that they're extremely weak, short-sighted, and in some cases, actually silly standards. Now, it's true that they've chosen their word wisely, because who is going to be against higher standards in education? Standards is one of these words that almost causes us to shake in our boots, because nobody's going to come out and say, oh, we don't need better standards. But when you look at the actual standards, what you find is they don't describe true standards of education. What they describe are low-level skills, not even very impressive skills. A good standard in education would be something along the lines of students should be taught Greek and Latin roots in order to increase their vocabulary. That would be a standard, and would give teachers something to know that they should do in the classroom that would help them work with students. Students should be taught English grammar by diagramming sentences, to include the use of the participle and the subjunctive by the age of the 5th grade. That would be a standard. Instead, what we're given in the standards is a list of things that sound impressive because they're written in educationese, but they're actually not impressive. So let me give you an example by reading one of these standards. This is in the 2nd grade, standard number 10. By the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry. In the grades 2 through 3 text complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Now that's pretty high sounding, right? In fact, these words, if you're not used to dealing with educationese, they may sound daunting, and you wouldn't dare want to challenge anybody on this being a good standard. But if you actually translate what these words mean, by the end of the year, that means at the end of the 3rd grade year, read and comprehend literature, that makes sense, including stories and poetry. Well, what kind of literature would they be reading other than stories and poetry in the 2nd and 3rd grade? In the grades 2 through 3 text complexity band, that's some jargon they throw in to try to rate text, which we'll talk about in a moment. Proficiently, with scaffolding as needed. Scaffolding is one of the buzzwords in education these days. All scaffolding means is teaching. It's what we used to call teaching. Scaffolding, if you follow the metaphor, is putting up scaffolding so that you can erect a building. Once the building is built, you take the scaffolding away. You can also translate scaffolding as simply help. And then finally, at the high end of the range. Now, I've translated this, here, or rather, this is how I would translate that statement, and I think it would make the standard make a lot more sense. Students in 2nd grade should read and understand more difficult books at the end of the year than at the beginning. They may need help, though. Is this a standard that should be dictated by the Common Core or even put into a public document? Who in his common sense does not know this to be true? And so that's the kind of thing that you run into with these standards. There's a whole big standard on discussion that they have, separate subpoints. And this is up in the high school level. The whole thing that has probably 800 words could be replaced by one word, Socratic. But that's not the way that people actually look at standards. So when we actually look, though, to see what in the 2nd to 3rd grade complexity band is the literature that the students are going to be reading that's advocated by the architects of the Common Core, you find out that it's really not that complex, and it may not even be considered literature. For example, among the list of books that you will find, there's one called Tops and Bottoms in the 2nd to 3rd grade level. Well, Tops and Bottoms on the Amazon page itself is advertised as a book to be read by 4 through 8-year-olds. It's a nice little book, but it's a sort of thing that you probably read to your toddler ever before going to school. Similarly, there's another book published in 2006 called Cowgirl Kate and Coco. And it's about this cowgirl Kate who says to her horse, "Hey Coco, let's go out and herd some cows." And the horse says, "But I am thirsty." And so Coco takes a drink. And then Cowgirl Kate says, let's go herd some cows. And Coco says, but I am hungry. And so Cowgirl Kate gives her horse an apple. And it goes on and on like that. It's nothing, it's cute, but it's not great literature, and it's not complex, and most of the words are in one mere syllable. And you say, well, what's wrong with that? They're just kids, let them have a little fun. If you actually look at the sort of things that they should be reading at second and third grade level, particularly in the third grade level, things like Alice in Wonderland, or Rikki Tikki Tavi, or Tales of the Arabian Nights, you will see that those are great stories with plots, with intrigue. The introduction to the first paragraph of Aladdin and the Magic Lamp is an astonishing look into human nature, because this man shows up who claims to be Aladdin's long-lost uncle and wants to use him in order to try to take over the world. Aladdin doesn't know whether he's being lied to or not. His father has died, so there's no one to protect him. You can dive into a story like that in just seconds almost of the children start reading. That is great literature. And that's the sort of thing that's going to help students understand the world and the human condition. But those stories are not recommended in the Common Core documents. Tales of the Arabian Nights are not recommended. No tall tales, such as Pecos Bill, are recommended. No Rikki Tikki Tavi. There is no Hans Christian Andersen at all recommended by the Common Core standards. So clearly we're forgetting some things that we would think would be a part of a great literature curriculum. So how do they justify this? How do they justify choosing this text as opposed to this other text? That's where you have to go to Appendix A, which I must tell you, if you've read Appendix A, my hat's off to you. It is a mind-numbing, drawn-written appendix, whose purpose is, I think, to establish a pseudoscience of text complexity. And what they want to say is that what we need to do is find complex texts, and that as students progress in their education, they should read increasingly complex texts. Another instance of manna from heaven that we didn't know without the Common Core coming around. But what's interesting about this, the way that they want to measure the complexity of a text is by a computer model, almost a mathematical model. Now this in itself is strange. I, for example, don't look at an algebra problem and say, you know, there's no humor in that algebra problem. I wish it sounded a lot more like Mark Twain. So why in the world should we take great literature and reduce it to some sort of complexity rating in a computer model? To me, it doesn't make any sense. If there's ever a case of apples and oranges, this is it. But here's the dirty little secret. The complexity model that they've chosen is called the Lexile framework, which is put out by a group called Metametrics. And it doesn't work. So, for example, if you run through the grapes of wrath through their model, do you know what grade level the grapes of wrath comes out at? Second grade. Here's the grapes of wrath. Give that to a second grader. Now, if their model is so flawed that they can't even tell you where the grapes of wrath belongs because they have no capacity for understanding the intrigue and the complexity of a story, as opposed to doing word counts on length of sentence or something like that, how in the world can they possibly articulate an entire curriculum? That's the problem that we're actually getting into. And just using common sense, you can understand that if you were to take Appendix A, Common Core State Standards, and run it through a Lexile index, you would get a fairly high grade. Why? Because it uses a lot of complex terms. It's not a readable document, but it's a highly complex document. Meanwhile, if you were to take, let's say, Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn and run that through the Lexile index, it would come out with a lower rating. So through this computer model, what they're able to do is now claim that, see, all of these essentially newspaper articles on recent events, they rate just as high in complexity as does Shakespeare or as does Melville. But the fact of the matter is, this model of looking at text from the beginning is entirely flawed, and I think there's a reason for that flaw. Another criterion that they have for the choosing of texts is range. This one, the criterion of range, they don't explain. And they don't have an appendix for it. And I think that's deliberate. I don't think they want us thinking very much about range. With range, what they want are modern authors. A lot of authors who are still living. A lot of these authors write, if you look in the textbooks and you even look at Appendix B to see the texts that are recommended, a lot of them are meant to be multicultural authors. A lot of them are modern or postmodern authors that deal with a lot of mature themes to include sexuality. So let's look to Appendix B and find out what kind of authors we find and see what sort of things are to be found there. And what I would say when I look at Appendix B, which is this long list of readings that they give you, is the overwhelming trend in these readings is that we have superficiality and bias. Now, I admit it's not easy to see at first, because if you just open up Appendix B to the high school authors, you will see names like Tolstoy or Gogol, maybe even Kafka's in there. And you say, well, these are good authors. So how can you possibly say that this is going to be a Mickey Mouse education? Well, there are a couple of things to know about that. The first thing to know is that complete works of literature are not going to be read in English classes. The reason is because under the standards regime, you might say, it doesn't pay to read a complete work of literature. The way that the standardized tests are set up is that the student encounters a text and only sees a page or two, has to make a quick decision on it, answer a multiple choice question, and then move on. So that's the way teaching of literature has progressed, or I should say regressed, over the last 40 or 50 years, to include going as far back as when I was in high school. And this even exacerbates this because what is pressed for in the Common Core is not deep thinking on rich, complex themes in literature and on character in particular, but rather quick decisions. And so the only things these students are going to be seeing, as I'll illustrate later, are just quick snippets of great literature. Therefore, they don't get the ability to dive deep into a complex human story and understand what kind of decisions are being made and what characters are made of, the way of their virtue and vice. So that's the first thing. The second thing that is also true is that there's a great deal of, I would say, bias in the way that these texts have been selected. Because when you start looking at the things that don't make their way into Appendix B, you have to start asking yourself questions. For example, there is no, at the high school level or the middle school level, there is no literature that is inspired by Christianity. Obviously, there is nothing from the Bible, because I don't think anybody wants to touch that with a 10-foot pole. So the opening chapters of Genesis, which has probably had more influence over the Western mind than anything that I can think of that's been written to include Homer, they don't appear. But I didn't expect them to appear. But some other things that should have appeared, such as Augustine's Confessions, are not there. Now, the Common Core says they like the reading of autobiographies, because that's nonfiction, and because you get to see characters indulging in decision-making. But there's no Augustine. Similarly, there's no John Milton. So Paradise Lost, one of the greatest epics, probably the greatest epic written in language, is not there. Equally mysteriously, when you get to American literature, find nothing of the Christian tradition in American literature. None of the poets or the authors from the Puritan era. John Winthrop's model of Christian charity that has the line that everybody remembers, that we should be as a city set upon a hill. Not there. Similarly, and even more surprising, Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Not there. And in fact, if you start picking through and trying to find anything that relates to the Christian tradition in American literature or in world literature, it's disappeared. Now, whether you're a Christian or not, you should find that astonishing, because almost any scholar will tell you that literature in this country and in the West in general comes from two different parents, and those parents are Athens and Jerusalem. There's not a lot of Athens in the Common Core standards, but there's nothing from Jerusalem. So it's almost as though we've become literary orphans. If you go on and look at some of the other things that are missing, they're even more astonishing. For example, the greatest man of letters in the 18th century, by far, and in fact, the architect of the American character, Benjamin Franklin, is not to be found in the standards. None of his autobiography, none of the parodies and satires, even though the Common Core claims that satire is a great way to understand a complex informational text. Not there. The most famous satires in American history were written by Franklin. Not there. Nor are Franklin's writings on electricity there, even though the Common Core says it wants students to engage in the reading of complex scientific texts. The most fundamental discoveries in the history of electricity written by one of the greatest American authors, are not there. Why? Is this oversight? Now here is where we would probably disagree. I think it's actually intentional. If it's not intentional, it's one of the most gross oversights I can imagine, because from time immemorial, at least for the last 200 years, children have been encouraged to read Franklin's autobiography because he's one of the greatest Americans who teaches them how to get, how to thrive in life, how to work, how to discipline one's character, and realize that if we're actually trying to prepare students for college and career readiness, what would be better than the greatest example of self-discipline and achievement written by one of the greatest founders in American history? And yet, it doesn't exist. So let's go on and try to figure out clear instances of bias where you can actually read it on the page. The way that the Common Core standards in Appendix B treat the Constitution of the United States is, I think, not just questionable, but appalling. The Constitution as a whole is not read according to the standards. Now I know that that may be because there's some social studies standards that they're working on, which will come into play. I don't have high hopes for those. But nonetheless, we're supposed to be reading in English class complex informational texts. And what's a more complex and better informational text than the Constitution? In the 6th through 8th grade level, the students read Amendment 1 of the Constitution. That's it. Not Amendment 2, not Amendment 10. That would be too much for 6th through 8th graders. They don't get to learn their Constitution. Even though in really solid curricula, you would find the students at that age level reading all of the Constitution and even some Supreme Court decisions. So what do they read if only Article 1? There's another text that's recommended, written by a modern scholar whose name is Linda Monk. And you can actually find this in the standards themselves. It's on page 95. And she has a take on the Constitution, which the students are recommended to read. And in this, what we find out is there is actually, and I won't read the whole thing, but there's something of an attack on the Founding Fathers for not including women or blacks or men without property in the Constitution. So, at the first level, what this is meant to be is kind of an attack on the founders of the Constitution itself. But the other thing that's astonishing to me about this is it's simply not true. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution leaves the franchise up to the states. The Constitution itself did not prevent anyone from voting. And at the time the Constitution was ratified, there were actually some women voting and some free black males voting in the northern states. So the idea that somehow the Constitution forbade blacks and women from voting is actually an historical fraud. If you go on and you find in the 11th through 12th grade level what they do with the Constitution, you find out that they get to read now the whole Bill of Rights. Nothing beyond the Bill of Rights, but the whole Bill of Rights. At the same time, they're giving another one of these texts, and this is on page 176 of the Common Core Standards, Appendix B. And this is a document written by a modern scholar that describes the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, mind you, the students have not read the Three-Fifths Compromise. That's not a part of their reading assignment. This is just a person talking about the Three-Fifths Compromise. And in his discussion of the Three-Fifths Compromise, the words that are used are camouflage, ugly, masterclass, and vicious. Why would those words be used to talk about something that the students aren't even studying themselves because they're only reading the Bill of Rights? Well, I think clearly it's so that the students will have to be, what will happen is that they will have a distaste for the Founding Fathers and a distaste for the Constitution itself, having not really studied it, but rather having had teachers program into their heads what they're supposed to think about the Constitution. Now, I'm not just imagining things here, because I know when I get freshmen in my freshman history classes, they cannot, when we read the Declaration of Independence, they cannot tell me what a right is. They can't give me even a definition that's remotely close. But they can say, almost on cue, that what all men created equal really meant was that all white men are created equal. That's what the founders meant by it. There again, that's not true. And Abraham Lincoln said it was not true, and defied anyone ever to find a document that said it was true. And Frederick Douglass said it wasn't true. And he knew a little bit about slavery. So what is going on here is not really teaching. It's programming, and it's programming in a particular political way. Now, this is not all that's going to go on. And I think the way to understand what really is going to go on in the classroom is actually to look at school textbooks. And this is where it gets frightening. Because when you look at these textbooks, you not only get to see what's being read and how small the things are that are being read in this sort of snippet version of literary text, but you also get to see in the teacher's editions of these texts how the editors are essentially programming the teachers to teach the students. And the more I look into these things, the more frightened I become. Some of the things that they're doing are just laughably ridiculous. And I'll give you an instance of that, and then I'll give you another instance of something that's a little more disturbing, and then I'll open it up for questions. In a book called The British Tradition, published by Prentice Hall, with a Common Core logo on it, with all of the Common Core standards printed at the very beginning, they have supposedly 17 pages devoted to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. At least that's what you would think, because Frankenstein seems to be the feature text. In those 17 pages, not a single word of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is actually written into the is actually written on the pages. There are 3 pages of Mary Shelley's words, which are simply an introduction to her writing Frankenstein. But otherwise, the things that are in there are, there's a modern author who talks about ghost stories that she heard as a child and dreams that she had. Students are invited via the teacher's edition to tell about ghost stories that they knew about growing up, to tell about any kind of Martians that they know that might have landed in New Mexico. The students are encouraged to dress up as monsters. There's a big picture of a Frankenstein monster, in case you didn't know what one looked like. And then, for 5.5 pages, 2 pages more than are given to Mary Shelley herself, we have, that's right, live from New York, it's Saturday night. They take a dialogue from Saturday Night Live, which is a spoof on Frankenstein, and put that in the textbook. Now I'll read from this dialogue because it's instructive. Villager number 1 to head villager. Well, maybe you're the monster. Head villager shakes his head. I'm not the monster. Points to Frankenstein's monster. Look at it. He's got a square head and green skin. Frankenstein's monster. Oh, great. Now it's a racial thing. You know what? You guys are a bunch of fascists. Villager with a lit torch again steps too close. Frankenstein's monster says, seriously, dude, get that fire away from me. Instructions in the margins of the teacher's edition. This is what the teachers are set to the students. Point out the use of the term fascist. Explain its traditional political meaning and how it has been extended to refer to any right-wing extremist group. Wow. So, what are right-wing extremist groups? Whom does that include, I wonder? So at any rate, that's the sort of thing that's going on in the place of doing the obvious thing, which is teaching the book, the philosophical novel called Frankenstein. None of the students will read Frankenstein. Now here's an even scarier thing. At what level is this exercise going on, where all these kids are dressing up as Frankenstein? Oh, I forgot to mention, they're also invited to write an autobiography of a monster. And why are they asked to write an autobiography of a monster? Is because traditionally monster stories are told by a human's perspective, and no one ever gets to understand the monster. So by writing an autobiography of a monster, the students will be asked to have a better understanding of monsters. I kid you not. At what level will this be going on in your children's school? The senior year in high school. The second semester of the senior year in high school. How in the world is this going to make them college ready? Well, that's, I think, just almost silly and laughable. Here's something that's a little more disturbing. I am using now the American book called the American, what is it? The American, not tradition, but experience, Volume 1. Prentice Hall with the Common Core logo on it. And this is a short story by an author whose name is Kate Chopin. It's called The Story of an Hour. And I'll read the introduction in the teacher's edition to give you a sense of what the story is about. Mrs. Mallard gets the unexpected news that her husband has been killed in an accident. She quickly recovers from the shock to discover that what she feels is relief. Though she mourns his passing, she delights in the freedom that will now be hers. Shut in her room, she relishes the opportunities ahead of her. When Mr. Mallard returns as unexpectedly as he supposedly died, so he didn't actually get killed in the accident, Mrs. Mallard suffers a fatal heart attack. The doctors, mistakenly assuming that she had been grieving, attribute the death to, quote, joy that kills. Now, in the student's edition, here's the background that we're given of Kate Chopin. The story of an hour was considered daring in the 19th century. The editors of at least 2 magazines refused the story because they thought it was immoral. They wanted Chopin to soften her female character, to make her less independent and unhappy in her marriage. Undaunted, Chopin continued to deal with issues of women's growth and emancipation in her writing, advancing ideas that are widely accepted today. What ideas are accepted today? That if your hubby kicks over, you're supposed to look at, the next 20 or 40 years of freedom that you're going to have? Did Mrs. Mallard have children? Why did she get married in the first place? Now, you may think this is just strange, and perhaps children should be introduced to all the different kinds of literature. But when we look once again at the questions that the students are supposed to be asked, I'm a little disturbed by them. This is called, in the teacher's edition in the margin, engaging the essential question. So this is the essential point that the textbook wants to get across. Point out to students that the bracketed passage tells first that Mrs. Mallard appreciated her husband, and second, of a physical action she takes. Number 2, ask students, which part of the paragraph illustrates Mrs. Mallard's independence? Answer. Notice how they put the answers in here. So the teachers are asking the questions, but the textbook is telling you what answer you're supposed to get. How is that a conversation? Once again, it sounds like this is the answer that's being programmed to the teacher, and this will be the only one that she likes to accept. At any rate, here's the answer. Her independence becomes clear when she spreads her arms to welcome the future. It is hers alone. Number 3, ask students. What does Mrs. Mallard's action symbolize, and how does it affect readers? Possible response. The action symbolizes Mrs. Mallard's desire for independence. Readers are forced to reflect on the negative aspects of 19th century marriages. The negative aspects of 19th century marriages. Weren't 19th century marriages sort of like marriages? Is the 20th century marriage the thing that we want to hold up as the ideal and the model? So I think what's going on here, and the students who would be reading this would be about 16 or 17 years old, that young men and women, but particularly women, who have romantic ideas about love, and who hope for someone wonderful to come into their lives, whom they can love and with whom they can have children, they're giving literature like this, which puts in their minds almost a bitterness about marriage and how somehow it's stifling. Is that the sort of thing that this country needs? Is that the sort of thing that the young people of Oklahoma need? So in summing this up, I would say that the Common Core does 2 big things. Number 1, it makes big promises and it doesn't deliver on them. And number 2, it's superficial in the extreme and it's utterly biased in its politics, and even more than its politics, in its moral message that's being sent to young people. So I hope that puts some things into perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Appreciate that. Quick shout, Dr. Moore does have a Ph.D. in history from the University of Edinburgh. I think you could see some of that come through in the examples he gave. I think you put a meat on a lot of the bones that we've heard before, a lot of the skeleton, and appreciate that. Are there any questions from legislators and or guests? Representative Kermit, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay, Dr. Moore?
I hear you a little bit, but someone may have to restate the question if I don't quite hear it now.
Okay, my question is, I gave a CD you did in DC at the Eagle Forum Conference to some of my colleagues when you used Ben Franklin's example about the Constitution. He wasn't entirely satisfied with it. And the response that I got was, this is just bad curriculum. This isn't standards. We would never use bad curriculum in Oklahoma. How would you answer that?
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great point that you make. And that's part of the real dexterity and cleverness, I think, of the Common Core. Because anytime you try to pin them down on something, they'll say, oh, we're just telling you what sort of standards to use. We're not telling you how to dictate, we're not dictating your curriculum. Local schools can figure these things out. States can figure these things out. And I think they know better than that. And I think that the people who are saying this expect us to be naive. I spent a lot of time around public schools, and here's what happens anytime you set up a set of national standards, or state standards, and also standardized tests. The state announces that there's going to be a standardized test. Panic. In every school. Panic. And then the teachers say, how are we going to teach this? We have no idea. And then what happens is the textbook companies drive in, and they say, here's your curriculum. We'll hand it to you. And there's a sigh of relief. Okay, now we know what to do. And so for 175 days of the year, the teachers teach to the test. For 5 days of the year, you take the tests. And that's the pattern. And this sets up what I call the 2 rules of standardized testing. Standardized testing rule number 1 is the teachers in the schools are absolutely slavish to what they think is going to be on the tests. Standardized testing rule number 2. The teachers never teach anything beyond what they think is going to be on the test. So in other words, if you don't see in Appendix B, Benjamin Franklin, no teacher and no school, especially no principal, is going to have and allow his students to spend any time, or they would say waste any time on Benjamin Franklin when they don't think they're going to be tested on it. So anytime there's a standardized test, that ends up dictating curriculum. That's the first part of the argument. The second thing is this. I mean, it's actually absurd that we should be having this conversation. Why in the world do you even have textbooks in literature? You should be reading complete novels. Your textbooks should not be a big lunky thing. I weighed the sophomore textbook in the Common Core. It weighs 8 pounds. Why do I give students copies of Moby Dick and To Kill a Mockingbird and Sophoclean plays? We don't need textbooks. And yet this is a big part of it. And I would suggest that without the textbooks, the standard would fall. But who in the Department of Education in the state of Oklahoma, and what school is going to say, we're going to ignore the tests, and we're just going to teach good, solid literature. And we're not going to use any of these really expensive textbooks that cook your breakfast for you by Prentice Hall, and they, by the way, also provide computer grading models and a bunch of handouts and all the rest of it. To be able to do that, which is, I think, the direction you should actually go in, it's the direction that all the schools that I work with take, you would have to change the entire culture of how public schools now work in the state of Oklahoma. And I think it's a worthy fight, but I think it's also, they're expecting us to be very naive if they want us to believe that, oh, these are just standards. You yourselves, you can decide whatever you want to do in your own classroom. That's a fiction, and everyone knows it.
Follow up. Okay, there's an analogy that Governor Huckabee has used of standards are like the football field, that regardless of where you live, a football field is 100 yards long, in increments of 10 yards, things like that. And that Common Core is just the football field. Each state can do their own curriculum, just like each football team has different coaches, different plays, different uniforms. And that's the analogy that he used. I'm getting a lot of people saying to me, that's what Common Core is. It's just the football field. We can do things our way inside that field. What is your answer to such an analogy?
No, ma'am, that's not a very good analogy, I'm afraid. I like Governor Huckabee, but that is not a good analogy. If you, as I suggested, if you go through these standards, you find out that they're not true standards of education. When people hear the word standards, they think that's going to mean good things that students are learning, attainments. But unless you actually apply standards to a curriculum, it doesn't tell you anything. Just to say, in the way that I described here, that students ought to read good literature in general, without telling them what that's going to be, then it's a statement that's not even worth making in the first place. And secondly, the way these statements are actually made trip you up, because it's not the case that they just say, here are the standards, go off and do with them what you want to. If you actually look in Appendix B, given some of the assignments that they prescribe on these standards, they're telling you how to teach literature. So, for example, they tell you to take Tom Sawyer, the selection of the fence painting scene in Chapter 2 of Tom Sawyer, and they tell you to look at Tom's morality and its relationship to authenticity and accountability, and also in the relationship to the plot themes of character, setting, and plot, and so on and so forth. And I don't want to go into all the details of this, but it's basically gobbledygook. But that is taken straight out of the standard. And if you were to actually apply that standard to the literature, which I actually do in written form, it just makes hash of the story. And it doesn't appreciate what Wayne is doing. It doesn't even allow students to laugh at the fact that Tom is so clever. It doesn't ask anything about Tom or how clever he is. And it uses these ridiculous words such as authenticity, which is a phrase that would be applied to some sort of depressed person after World War I who had shell shock or something like that. That doesn't describe Tom Sawyer. And yet that description of literature is taken straight out of the standards. So what you have to understand is these standards are actually describing ways of teaching literature, and those ways of teaching literature are bankrupt, because they don't take literature on its own terms as being great stories about human beings, both great and flawed human beings, working out their problems and their destiny through complex events. That's what literature is. But the way they teach you to teach it is through maybe what you had in high school, but these mindless sort of plot devices and things like that only dumb down the literature. So the standards business is not helpful. And these standards in particular are misleading, poorly written, they're purely education aids. And to the extent that there's any common sense in them, you could probably retranslate them and reduce it to no more than a page. But all of the junk you would then be inheriting from that would just get you in the way. So I've looked very closely at and really have a discussion about what standards are, because they're being sold for something that they're really not.
Thank you. Any other questions? Dr. Moore, we definitely appreciate you taking your time to talk with us and teach us a little bit about the standards, and thank you very much, and we would love to see you in Oklahoma sometime.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.